1963, as Martin Luther King was at the forefront of the civil rights movement, he rolled into Birmingham, Alabama, somewhat dejected because his efforts had come to almost nothing in the neighboring Atlanta, Georgia. He'd been working tirelessly and seeing very little fruit in terms of a public groundswell for his effort to try and win basic human rights and freedoms for his black brothers and sisters all over the country. And what he did was he became even more strategic than he had ever been. Birmingham, Alabama was in many ways the centerpiece of the racially motivated segregation that you found in the south of the United States. And he was up against a fierce opponent, a man by the name or nicknamed Connor Bull, he was charged by the local government for running the security systems and services for Birmingham, Alabama, a deeply racist man and a man almost licking his lips with the opportunity to have an opportunity to be violent towards those who were protesting. And the protests initially got nowhere until they decided to use what they had. They started putting on events for school children in some of the local churches, which weren't formally protests because nobody was really coming to the marches and the protests. But when the white security authorities, between the police and the fire chiefs, they saw buildings filling up with young black people, lots and lots of them, they began to amass the fire engines and the police cars and indeed the canines, the dog unit. Now, I'm sure you've all seen the famous photo from that year when there's a young boy coming out of one of those meetings and there's an Alsatian leaping towards him and biting his arm. Martin Luther King and his associates used a strategic approach in order to provoke Connor Bull, the governor of security, to order the fire hoses to fire, the fire hoses to deploy their water, to start to spray the young people and to attack them with the dogs, because he knew it would be all over every front page of the newspapers the week after. He essentially made Connor Bull tip his hand in order that it would wheel the cause of justice forward. He made him overplay his hand in a way that would change the level of the groundswell of public support for his cause. We have a fight over freedom and rights in Exodus. We have the tyrant Pharaoh and Moses looking to plead on behalf of God's people to let them be free and to let them be loosed from the unjust structure of slavery in which they're in. But more than that, you've got God overseeing the whole thing. You've got God essentially goading Pharaoh into tipping his hand, which it looks hopeless, might even look a bit barbaric at times, and that's one reading you can make of it. But there's hope in it, because ultimately what we're going to find in this chapter is the deep commitment which God has to the freedom of his people. And it's through the freedom of his people which I hope to thread the narrative through to our day and try and apply it to us. Exodus, as we've thought about already, is very much continuing the story from Genesis. The grand portrait that we get is that God has made a good world, and there is this sort of initially a small rebellion that then becomes an alternative way of seeing the world and being in it, that opposes and challenges God's ways and commands. And that leads to further and further human decay and degradation. And we're seeing the fallout of that in the system that the Pharaoh has in Egypt to oppress the Israelite people. But if you like, what's at the center of this kind of battle between Pharaoh and the God of the Israelites is who is really God? You know, who has ultimate power? In the world of the ancients and the pharaohs, now it's commonly thought that the pharaohs were thought of as gods. They weren't exactly, but they were thought of as the God's ruler on earth, their appointed or elected official who could speak out and deliver the will of the gods. And there were many gods, but Pharaoh was thought to have a special resonance with them and a way in which he could steer the people in the will of the gods. And the question is going to be, so who is God? And will the God of Israel actually be able to bring out and form this people to worship himself? Because they've been here for 400 years. They've lived with this great catalogue and litany of gods and thinking Pharaoh was probably the mouthpiece of them. So it's very easy for us with all our knowledge to read back and go, well, yes, obviously Yahweh is the real God, and obviously he's going to success in me. But that wouldn't have been obvious to them, that they were going to actually be formed into a cohesive people group that are going to gather around the one true and living God and find them their identity and centerpiece in that. So, in thinking about the freedom that God looks to bring, I want to do it under three headings today. I want to look at, firstly, the freedom to worship, and then secondly, the freedom from tyranny, and thirdly, the freedom that God can give us even through suffering. Freedom to worship, freedom from tyranny, and freedom that God looks to give us even through suffering. Freedom to worship. Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Sometimes the book of Exodus is spun as it's all about freedom from slavery. It is about freedom from slavery. But the way this narrative is framed is so that we don't just stop there. In many ways, freedom from slavery, right at the center of it, is just not enough in and of itself. It's freedom from something in order to engage in something else. Moses' key request is, "Let my people go." And I remember singing in primary school. When in primary school, I'm old enough that you sung these kinds of songs, "Let my people go." But it doesn't stop there. It's "let my people go that they may hold a festival of worship to me in the wilderness." What God is doing through Moses is saying, you go and challenge that tyrant and say, there is a God other than the gods that you worship. He is the true God, and he is taking his rightful place as the one to whom worship should be prescribed. And what's Pharaoh's response? Well, Pharaoh's response is essentially, "They shall have no other gods before me." Because in his world, he can't actually conceive of any power or being that could possibly usurp his. He has quite a narrow field of vision, which basically looks to encircle whatever power and system of power that he has, and any perceived threat to that is seen as illegitimate, because in some sense, the most important thing, or the most godlike thing, is the system that he's created that benefits him. And God is coming to challenge that and say, not only do this people need to be free, but they need to be free to worship me, because that's where everything else is going to fall into place. And that has carry over into our modern day, because you and I live in a world where probably there is no greater premium placed on anything than freedom and personal and individual autonomy. And in many ways, it's quite a recent thing since the 1800s to have it at this level. But nevertheless, if you were to try and do a survey of what is absolutely sacred in our society, it is probably that: individual freedom and autonomy. Now, freedom's important, and it's incredible and it's amazing. And I think when you look at the story in the garden and how God sets man and woman in it, and he asks them to cultivate it, there's everything around them, every fruit and every tree they could possibly like. It's analogous for the fact that we are meant to dwell in freedom. There's something within us that yearns for freedom, and that's good. But the point of the garden was we were free and in a connection with God that gave the experience a kind of holistic quality to it. It wasn't just free for its own sake. And people quite often don't know what to do if they are just free for their own sake. They need something to replace it with. Look at the reoffenders rate that we have when people come out of incarceration in our society, because you need to replace, if you are used to being in chains, you need to relearn and learn how to replace it with something that orders the rest of your life. And that is the centrality of that's how worship functions very much in the Old and in the New Testament. If you get the worship part right and the vertical connection to God, it has a way of ordering the rest of your life in a good and in a whole and in a wholesome way. And so freedom to worship is essential. And conversely, if you don't have the worship bit, things tend to spin, the wheels tend to spin off and things tend to degrade. You could make a really good argument that the reason Pharaoh is a tyrant and why he doesn't want any of this is because he doesn't have any sense of that accountability and vertical connection. There's an excellent argument to be made. I think it's Stephen Fry that makes it, that whatever you believe about a constitutional monarchy and whether we should have the monarchy or not, there's something quite powerful, even if it's symbolically, that once a year the Prime Minister has to go and bow to someone that isn't themselves, and it perhaps puts a check on them being a complete tyrant. Do you see? The looking upwards, the freedom to worship is important. And when it's not there, things go badly, as has happened so many times in various societies and places all over the world. The famous letter that Martin Luther King writes from Birmingham jail when he's thrown in jail for the protests he brings there, do you know who he writes it to? Church leaders, moderate church leaders, who he sees as being hugely complicit in the systems that are oppressing him and other black men and women in the South. And he's trying to waken them up, because there's a connection between worship and freedom. When that worship is ordered properly, we actually care about freedom and freedom to worship. And blacks had to even worship in a segregated way in the South. Why? Because the white moderate clergy of the South were comfortable. They had a good life. Nobody was coming and threatening their lives or the lives of their families or children because of just who they were. And so, because they weren't, because they weren't being threatened, they didn't feel like they had to get into the fight. And they weren't awake to the tyranny that was going on all around them. Freedom to worship is essential, because when we worship and we have that connection, it orders things in a way that we evaluate life properly and what really matters in it. And the issues that God tells us again and again in the scriptures that he cares about, the weighty matters of justice and mercy, as even Jesus puts it. And when we have an excess of freedom without anywhere to put it, and that can look like, what would that look like in our day? Probably an excess of comfort, of security, of well-being. Not for everyone in our society, but that's probably, compared to all other societies in history, that's probably where the danger is for us. Is, okay, we might not be under any tyranny or slavery as such, but maybe the excess of freedom and comfort that we have, or wealth, or whatever it is, maybe that's a problem. Maybe that disorders our connection to God. Maybe that makes the priorities wrong. Maybe that makes us not care very much about issues of people who are suffering injustice and who have a lack of mercy and people to stand up for them and advocate for them. The freedom has to be placed within the context of a freedom to worship, because that's actually how God created the world. That's the created order in a nutshell. A free people who are at liberty, who have their needs taken care of, but crucially are connected and within that freedom are set free to worship God, so that the creation that God made can function according to its design. Freedom to worship, and then also freedom from tyranny. There's no making a mistake about it that Pharaoh was an utter tyrant in this story. Moses goes and makes a reasonable request. At this stage, it isn't let us go so that we can clear off and never come back. At this stage, it's let us go so we can hold a festival of worship to God in the wilderness. And Pharaoh's answer is to crack down and say, no, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. And then what does he do? He gives the order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge, don't supply them with straw for making bricks, let them go and gather their own straw. Then the slave drivers, who are Israelites by the way, went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says, I won't give you any more straw, go and get your own. And so they scatter and they begin to look for stubble all over the land in order to make straw. This is just a vivid depiction of things grinding downwards, really into the grave. St. Gregory of Nyssa, who's one of the early church fathers, makes the analogy that the fact that they go and start to try and find stubble to make the bricks is no coincidence, because stubble and the dust of the earth is quite often synonymous with death in the Old Testament. And so you're meant to get this picture. Quite often, like some of the Victorian poets did in the times of the Industrial Revolution, they would make, there was one famous line where one of the factory workers is sewing at once a seam and a shroud. I'm trying to remember my English literature degree, but they're sewing a seam and a shroud because the work that they're doing, rather than being life-giving, is actually grinding them down further and closer towards death. And it's the same here. They're getting down lower to the dust of the earth because their work is so grinding and alienating and dehumanizing that it's bringing them closer to death rather than life. And what's Pharaoh's thinking in this? He has a challenge to his leadership, and what he decides to do is to try and consolidate his power and bolt even more of it on and try and remove freedom even further, which is the playbook for every tyrant that has ever ruled and has ever lived. Tyranny is actually a really weak form of leadership. It's a bit like the bully in the playground. They pick on other people that are smaller than them. They try to act tough because really they're deeply fearful and insecure people in and of themselves. And there's loads of overlap in the Bible between weak and fearful leaders and absolute tyrants, because this is the only tool in their box. They want to consolidate their own power, so they try and hunker down and create more authority because they don't have any other tools in order to continue ruling. But it's not, and they've got no conception of where they stand in the hierarchy of things. They think they are God. But it's not just them that's contributing to this tyranny. Because I read to you, what do the slave drivers do? And the overseers, who are as good as slave drivers, they went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says. Think of that. They are of the same kith and kin as the Israelites who are having to try and find stubble to make bricks. They come from the same families. They can all trace their lineage back to Joseph, who came down in the famine. And they are there, and they're saying to those people who they're supposed to share a bond with, this is what Pharaoh says, so I'm passing it on. Nothing to do with me. It's just I'm just doing a job here. Do you see? It's not just Pharaoh that's the problem. It's the people that are taking part in it. They're enabling his tyranny. They're not standing up to it. And they're maybe thinking, well, you know, I need a paycheck. I need an easy life. And they're doing this for an easy life. Does it pay off for them? The Israelite overseers in verse 15 appeal to Pharaoh. Why have you treated your servants this way? And Pharaoh says, lazy. That's what you are. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw. You must produce your full quota of bricks. So they perhaps made the bargain in the equation that, well, if we just go along with the, then maybe we'll end up with a half-decent slot in this whole system, and we're not. Now they're in the worst position of all, because they've got Pharaoh and the Egyptian slave drivers giving them what for, and they've got their own people saying at them, we can't do it. And we're not going to be able to deliver the quota of bricks for you. So they're right in the middle of a hot rock and the hard place of their own making. Because they didn't stand up and they didn't say anything. And that bargain is made again and again. Now here's the application, because we're thinking about freedom from tyranny. Tyranny is everywhere. It's always going to be everywhere. And it might not look like a dictator or the likes of what's going on in Sudan just now with a military dictator who wants to consolidate their own power over an entire nation. Might look much more local. But there's always a price to be paid for going along with that. Look at just now the predictions that Rishi Sunak's facing in the local council elections in England. He's facing a wipeout of perhaps 1,000 seats because he's part of the last thing that went before him. He might be a bit more decent than perhaps Boris Johnson was, but he was there. He went along with it for quite a long time. Same at our new First Minister's having the same problems. Now, it should be stated that we don't know if anything's been proven, whether anything was wrong with that or not. But even still, the very legacy and the tarnishing of it, going along with it doesn't pay off. The lesson for us is, well, the obvious one is don't be Pharaoh, don't be a little God. Don't be a little tyrant, because you will be little in relation to God himself. Don't try and consolidate your power and act in weakness by ruling harshly over others in whatever sphere of influence you have. But perhaps what is more salient for us is the application of don't enable little tyrants, little pharaohs. Or as someone once said to me in the Carloway church, there are little Hitlers everywhere. When I was locum there, when I was training. But there are, because unfortunately, it seems to be a real core human response is to try and do that, to try and preserve and hold on to as much power as we possibly can by ruling over others. What could that look like for you? There are some people, and they might be in your community or your extended family system, and they have a lot of control, maybe in their family dynamic, or control in a lot of rooms that they're in any given situation. And what they often depend on is that if anyone were to say anything, it would make it a bit awkward, and there would be a bit of a whoof in the room if anyone said anything. Maybe the challenge to you and I is to be the person that says something and to put up with the awkwardness in order that the challenge might come to their tyranny and their power, because what they get to do is they get to control an entire dynamic and group of people, because especially as reserved Scottish people, we're a bit like, well, I don't want to rock the boat, so I don't want to be that person. Be that person. Because it is no virtue to enable tyranny of any form. None of it glorifies God. But you can glorify God by not being one of the moderate clergy in Alabama who was too cowardly to speak up for the rights of those that weren't actually part of their group. And you can be a person who brings a little light. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with a little bit of awkwardness, but there's a lot wrong with tyranny and people ruling over and controlling the emotions and the dynamics of others. What a simple calling, but what a profound one. Because there really is too much of that in the world. And God cares deeply about us being free from tyrants. And I think this narrative is beautifully constructed so that we see that, yes, Pharaoh's tyranny is a problem, but so is the people who enable him and who go along with him and just don't say anything and bank on and bet on an easy life. But here's the real secret: you're not going to get an easy life. If you go along with and enable tyranny in every way, you're going to pay for it. So you might as well put up with a moment of awkwardness and uncomfortableness so that you don't have to pay for it big time down the road when their tyranny creates utter chaos and you're stuck in a really rock and hard place then. God cares about your freedom from tyranny and my freedom from tyranny and everybody's freedom from tyranny. And lastly, and most briefly, we have a God who's invested in our freedom to worship, invested in our freedom from tyranny, and even caring about our freedom through and in the midst of suffering. I love this, how Moses returns to the Lord and said, "Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people?" At the end of the chapter. "Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought trouble on this people, and you haven't rescued your people at all." Just an aside, allow yourself permission to question and ask God why he's doing what he's doing, because Moses did. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go." Notice how Moses is struggling with the why. And we're meant to feel Moses' struggle. Why, God, are you allowing slavery? Why does a good God let bad things happen? Why am I suffering? Why are the people that I know suffering? Why is God allowing any of this? You must have asked that at some time. Lots of people ask that. And God doesn't actually answer the why. And let me save all of us some time and say, I don't think God ever will or ever does answer the why suffering happens and is allowed. Never happens in the Bible. You don't get the why. Okay, so if you're not going to get, by the way, you don't get the why if you don't believe in God either, of why of suffering. So that doesn't really solve the problem. But you don't get the why. But he does answer with the what. So he doesn't engage in, he's saying, Moses, I'm not going to answer that question of why, but I am going to show you what I'm going to do through this suffering. This suffering that you and your people are going through is a process by which I am going to show Pharaoh that he's not God, by which I am going to show you that I am God and that I am your God. And I haven't been not listening. I am deeply concerned about this. And I'm going to do something, but I'm going to do it in my time because I am God. And I'm going to do it in my way because I am God. So he doesn't give him the why, but he gives us on the what. And what's he essentially saying to Moses? What's he choosing to do? Think about it. God could have snapped his fingers, and God could have done either the Red Sea thing or all the plagues, and he could have just done it like that in the form of some sort of primitive nuclear bomb that took out all the Egyptians and freed but he doesn't. In a way, God puts himself in this contingency with Moses and the other people who are fighting for their freedom. And there's this back and forth, and they're wrestling with God, and they're asking God why, and they're going to Pharaoh, and it's not working, and then it looks like it's going to work, and then it doesn't work. And doesn't that just sound like your life and my life? With whatever it is that we're aiming at. It doesn't all just sort itself out overnight. It's a long, drawn-out process. Sometimes it tires us. Sometimes we feel some victory. But particularly if we're suffering, it can find us just really fed up and worn out with the whole thing. And God is saying the most important thing about this is that we work together. There's something profound and something that is quite freeing about seeing that we're in a process of working with God to bring about whatever he is doing in the world. And sometimes that means that he uses, as I was telling the kids, whatever it is that we're suffering and going through to bring that about. Let me just wrap it up with a quotation from Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he says, "The human progress does not come down on the wheels of inevitability, but rather it happens by the tireless labor of men and women working with God." Human progress does not come down on the wheels of inevitability, but rather with the tireless labor of men and women working with God. And nobody knew what it was like to work with and suffer for God and for the causes of justice and peace and mercy as much as Dr. King did. So he knew what he was doing. He was writing that from a jail. If he could write that from a jail, and he still had a vision of the fact that God was using all of that in order to bring about change and lasting justice and peace, then whatever you and I are suffering, maybe there's a freedom where we're learning within that this is actually better than being disconnected and away from God. Because God has ultimately brought us into this connection with him so that we might worship him, so that might give a sense of perspective and order to the rest of our lives. And then also, he's shown us within that he cares about us being free from the tyranny of little gods, and he cares about us not enabling that in any way, because ultimately he is a God of freedom and justice. And whatever that costs us, whatever the journey looks like for us, and however much it hurts and the scars that we get, all of it can be redeemed, because when we are with God and we are working with him and partnering with him, we have the unassailable privilege of knowing that as part of his kingdom we are working in whatever corner of it for a better world that will hopefully produce freedom for more and more. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.